Welcome to the channel, everybody. Appreciate you guys coming and checking it out. If you're new to the channel, think about hitting that subscribe button for me. Alright, so what we got going on today is we have two BFRO reports from the state of Washington, the beautiful state of Washington. So one of them is a story about a Bigfoot that was underwater and got hooked on a fishing line. So wait till you guys hear about this one. This one is crazy. Alright, so let's get to it. First BFRO report is report number 1568. This occurred in October of 1993 in Mason County, Washington, on Harstine Island. At the time of the sighting, I was homeless and living in my station wagon. I always took showers at the campground on Harstine Island. At about 11:30 p.m., I was traveling north on the island and was doing the speed limit and watching out for deer in the road because there are a lot of them on the island. I was coming up to the Grange Hall turn where there was a connecting road that travels south on the eastern side of the island. There is a hill at the point of the intersection, and I slowed down to the recommended speed because there is a hairpin turn just down the other side. As my lights came over the top of the hill, I could see into the large pasture next to the road where it turned left. It was a clear fall night and the moon was out, so I could see very good. I noticed something standing in the field I couldn't remember seeing before. I thought it was a tree stump at first, but there wasn't one there before. Then I thought about the horses that are usually there in the daytime, but it just wasn't it. I was slowing down to about 10-15 miles per hour so I could turn left when this thing turned its head and looked straight at me. I remember quickly slowing the car and almost came to a stop. As I rolled through the corner, it turned in the same direction and walked at the same speed I was rolling. It was absolutely huge. It wasn't very far from my car, maybe 40 feet. The field is about 3 to 4 feet below the road, and this thing towered over me, so I had to look over the top of my steering wheel to see it. I could smell it, and it burned my nose. My windows were up, but the heater was on. It took long strides and was actually moving faster than me, and I stopped the car because I thought it was going to come over the barbed wire fence into the road in front of me. It walked down the fence line, and I followed at a distance, but I could still see it very clearly. At the corner of the fence line, the road turned sharply to the right, and it just stepped over the fence with no trouble at all. I remember feeling scared to death, and the hair on my body was standing up. It crossed the road at the corner and disappeared on the other side in some brush. The turnoff to the park is about a quarter mile past that and to the left. I raced to the campground and took my shower as quickly as I could. I remember almost being in tears when I came out to get back in my car. I was still pretty shook up, and I knew it was not far away from where I was. I usually stayed the night at the campground on those nights, but not that night. The next day I returned to the area of the sighting, and I didn't see any horses or tree stumps, but I did see where the fence was pushed down. I talked to a friend of mine who lives on the island, and he said there were 3 or 4 of them there. I never came back at night again. Wow, that's crazy. Seeing a Sasquatch and following it down the road like that, that would be a pretty great sighting to have. Too bad the young lady wasn't thinking about recording, or maybe she didn't have a phone at the time. She said she was homeless. Hope she's doing better now. Alright, let's get to this next story. Okay, this next report is from BFRO, and it's report number 7382. This occurred in July of 2001 in Cowlitz County, Washington. Up until last year, I owned a bait and tackle store on the Kalama River in Kalama, Washington. I guess I would have to say that there were some strange things happening to several of my customers who would fish directly upstream from my store at a hole known as Beginner's Hole. For instance, one of my customers, Steve, and his girlfriend Tasha arrived on the river a couple of hours before daylight and decided to get some rest in their car before the usual crowd arrived. They laid their seats back and turned up a radio when all of a sudden something hit the driver's side window with enough force to almost break the glass. Steve later told me that he thought it must have been a rock of considerable size as it shook the whole car. He immediately started the car and turned on his lights only to find nobody could be seen in the large parking area. And Tasha was so shook up by it that she made him leave and spend the rest of the night parked under the lights of my store. I guess I really didn't think much of it until approximately a week or so later at about 9:30 p.m. after just locking up for the night and being startled by someone frantically pounding on my store door only to open it and find a very scared fisherman who had claimed to have seen a Bigfoot within a block of my store, just standing on the riverbank looking at him walk by on the road 75 feet away. It was late May or early June, so it had just gotten dark. I can't remember ever seeing a grown man so afraid of a wild animal in my life as Jason was at that moment. He just kept saying that he just witnessed Bigfoot and to stay inside for fear it was going to get us. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to talk him into showing me where he had seen it, but he refused to go outside, insisting I was crazy because he said it must have been at least 7 foot tall. A week or so later, I went up to Beginner's Hole at about 10:30 p.m. with my beer distributor Travis to do some glow balling for summer run steelhead, as I had for many years in the past when it started to get warmer and the fish seemed to get more active. We pulled into the parking area and I ran over the bank so I could get the first cast because it was usually payday and Travis stood in front of the headlights still rigging his pole. I had taken several casts with no luck when I noticed the fish downriver in the deep hole were jumping like I had never seen before. I climbed up the bank as Travis was just finishing and told him to come on. We were going to walk down and see what was going on. As we arrived at the hole about 200 yards downstream, we quickly climbed down the bank and began casting. Travis was located 50 feet below me behind a large bush when I heard a loud splash from his direction. Thinking he must have fallen in, I yelled to see if he was all right, when to my surprise we were face to face and he was yelling for me to run in a very panicked voice. I wasted no time following him up the bank because it must have been something pretty serious to scare Travis, as he stands 6 foot tall and weighs over 220 pounds. As we climbed in the car, he was yelling something about a giant ape-like figure that had porpoised, went under, and then came back out of the water and jumped. Whatever it was, it must have been very large, judging by the sound that I had heard and seeing that Travis was very wet from the splash that it had made. I guess that's when I started believing that maybe Bigfoot was real. Being very knowledgeable of the river and the fish runs, I came to the conclusion that combined with the fact that for the last few years the woods had been closed to public entry 90% of the season, and that the summer run steelhead were being let out of the lower hatchery, and almost all of them stopping at Beginner's Hole because that's where they had been released, that maybe it had come down from upriver looking for food and quite possibly had found a steelhead paradise. It took several days before I or Travis had found the nerve to venture back up there, but the thought of those fish made us finally give in to our fear. What a mistake! Arriving at the hole, I, as usual, ran over to the bank to get the first cast, and Travis, as usual, stood rigging his pole in the headlights. As I started to cast, I felt very uneasy and continued looking up and down the river trying to see in the nighttime darkness. When directly across the river from me, I heard a baseball-sized rock hit the water a few feet off of the far bank. I strained my eyes to see what had thrown it, thinking that after telling several of my customers of the early incident that maybe someone was playing a trick or something. That's when I heard it, a low, deep, moan-like sound that turned into a high-pitched scream. I have been in the woods enough to know that there is no animal that could possibly make the noise that I had just heard, and it surely wasn't a customer. As I screamed for Travis, I felt reassured to see him already coming over the bank asking what the hell had made that noise. He couldn't even finish his sentence before the sound let loose again. It seemed to be on the opposite shore and running directly away from us at a speed I had never seen an animal run at before. It almost seemed like a bird, it was going so fast through the trees, directly away from us up the hill. It had seemed like seconds before it reached the top of the hill, maybe an eighth of a mile away, and remained there for several minutes making a noise that had every hair on your entire body standing at perfect attention. Then as quick as it had started, it stopped, and we found ourselves climbing in the car, speeding for the safety of my store, where we sat up all night going over and over what we had just heard. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that I was forced into going back there because I am a licensed fishing guide and the only one who does nighttime drift boats trips down the river. Seeing that I had two paying customers, one a young man in his late 20s from Iowa and the other a regular customer who also owns a house on the river, I felt obligated to do my best to get them fish, and as scary as it may seem, I knew that Beginner's Hole was the spot. I launched the boat directly into Beginner's Hole about 3 p.m. and had planned to take about a 2-mile trip down the stream, hoping to go get a quick fish or two out of the hole and get the hell out of there. But the fish just weren't going for it. Every time I suggested that we head on down, I was cut off by the local homeowner telling me that we were in the hot spot and he wanted to try it longer and to quit being a baby, that there was no such thing as Bigfoot. He too had heard the rumors going around about what I had seen. As he teased me, it got the Iowa guy asking all kinds of questions because that was the first he had heard of the monster that lived in Beginner's Hole. I tried to avoid the whole thing as best as I could, but he wasn't about to leave it alone and talked me into telling my story. I was almost finished reciting the month's events when something happened that I will never in all of my life forget. All of a sudden, the pole that I was holding almost got ripped from my hands and I yelled, "Fish on!" Or so I thought. It took but seconds to realize that something was not right by the way it was pulling. I felt like I had hooked into a bale of hay that had floated by in the heavy current, but yet you could tell that it was alive. The Iowa guy was screaming for me to give him the rod because that was to be his first steelhead ever, and he took the rod from my hands. As I stood there in my drift boat watching the line slowly peel off the reel, I couldn't help but feel confused about what could possibly be attached to the other end when it stood up in the middle of the river 30 feet below my boat and seemed by the glowing corkies and sand shrimp to be hooked in the left shoulder and not at all comfortable with the whole situation. Nor were either of the two gentlemen in the front of my boat. The Iowa guy was shouting something about being a dead body, and I can't recall the local man saying anything at all. The river was about 4.5 feet deep where it was, and it seemed to me in the moonlight to be standing waist deep, slowly swinging its arms trying to get free. As I pulled my anchor and tried to stay my distance, the Iowa guy was pulling for all he was worth. I was using 30-pound line and there wasn't much chance of it breaking. Maybe 3 minutes passed or so, it seemed like, before it finally freed itself and dove underwater, never to be seen again. Just a wake of water heading downstream into a deep hole as far as I could tell, never coming up for a breath in at least 100 yards till it rounded the bend and out of sight. To this day, I have not fished Beginner's Hole, and I am no longer a guide. I mainly stay at home and work on computers. What happened to me on the Kalama River will stay with me for the rest of my life, and I'm sure that all of this sounds pretty strange, but I will tell anyone who wants to know the names of every person involved and would gladly take them to the place and show them. I am almost certain that if someone was to spend next spring and summer at Beginner's Hole on Kalama River between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., it will quite possibly change the way they view Bigfoot for the rest of their lives. Wow. Crazy. Imagine catching a Bigfoot while you're trying to catch some salmon and it like jumping out of the water, and like, man, this is one of the first times that I've heard about Bigfoot being able to swim underwater like that. But you know what? It makes sense. Grizzly bears, and I don't know about black bears, but I'm pretty sure black bears too, they both dive underwater going after salmon. If they can do it, and Bigfoot is much more intelligent and more like humans, believe me, they could probably do it too. And like living in the wild and being in the water as much as they are, just imagine how great swimmers they might possibly be. Wow, something else. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, and if you're new to the channel, you know, that subscription button, go ahead and hit it for me. I would really appreciate that. Until next time, guys, remember, where there is a WILLSTAR, there is a way. We'll see you later.